A nonconformist minister, James Marshall Mather, 1851 to 1916, was born at Darlington in the county of Durham and educated at Lincoln. Later, he lived in Lancashire and had the ambition to become the novelist of that county, and in particular of its working classes. The following series of short stories is taken from his book, The Roaring Loom, published in 1898. By Roaring Loom. Vengeance is Mine, by J. Marshall Mather. He was a man shrewdly observant and of ready wit, with no gods in his creed, save his masters and his engine. He had graduated, too, in a hard school, and of sentiment he possessed little, and that of the coarser grain. He was small of stature and lean, with a clean-shaven, tallowy face, nor had 50 years of fire-beating and engineering sweat the spirit out of this ghoul of manufacturing life. He used to make the engine-house his home, sleeping in winter by the side of the warm boilers, and in summer stretching himself on the slates of the shed, and closing his eyes beneath the silent stars. Chick nor child he had none, neither had he wife. The ponderous machine he tended was in turn both wife and child to him, and he knew its every mood and movement, now coaxing with kindly word, now blaming with wild imprecations, while it, in turn, would wink at him with its steely eyes, or nod defiance with its ponderous beam, nor forget to growl in wrath from its revolving wheel. But he was master, and knew it, and the engine knew he was master too. At first he was wont to look upon me with suspicion, counting me a foreigner, and rebutting my frequent good mornings with an ill-mannered grunt. In time, however, we became better friends, until at last I was permitted to sit and chat with him in the engine-house, which was his royal domain. When he was too busy to chat, I would watch him as he stooped and bent and crawled at his dangerous task of lubrication, his arms disproportionately long, stealing like serpents amid a network of cranks and wheels, the sweat oozing from his wizened features, and muttered oaths the while falling from his close-drawn, bloodless lips. One winter's afternoon, as I thus watched him, dreading lest every moment the monster would devour its little lord, he suddenly swung himself down from where he had been standing, oil-can in hand, and turning to me said, "It's a grand 'un, isn't it?" and with admiring glance continued, "It's saddled some brass in its time, and no mistake, and it never goes on to spree like some of 'em it works for." Then, polishing one of its brasses with the wad of cotton waste he held in his hand, he climaxed all by saying, "That's a greatly Christian, that, for thou well he always does as thou'rt told." I looked up at the engine, thus apostrophised. There it pulsed, a thing almost conscious, the great sway beam rising and falling in obedience to the rod of steel that moved from out and then withdrew into the dark cylinder against which the old man stood. At the further end swept the huge fly-spur, communicating its driving power to the factory behind, while the outstretched arms of the governors, rotating in silence, held in check the mighty demon, to me so titanic and threatening. A jet of gas above my head threw a network of fantastic shadow from the moving machinery onto the whitewashed wall beyond, while the monotonous roar seemed to sound applause and assent to the engineer's rude praise. He was in a garrulous mood that afternoon, and continued, "It's seen some saints and played some marlets in its time, I can tell you. 40 year come next Candlemas since it were fixed, and it's never had but 2 meisters, Dandy Dick and myself. You never knew Dandy Dick? No, he were dead long afore you came in these parts. He were th' engineer when I were fire-beater, and had a terrible conceit of hisself, like as he thought hisself too good for common folk, a boon porridge, as we call it about here. He'd a bit of learning and all, and that made him worse, and, to top all, he lived with an old aunt as kept a stocking up chimbley flue. Happen it were no wonders chap walked a bit higher nor his shoon. And had Dandy Dick a history? I asked. A what? Questioned the old man. A history. I mean, was there some story in his life you remember him by? For I knew the old man was eager to open one of the seals in his strange book of reminiscence. Yai, he'd a history, was the response, and a sad un and all. If you'll wait till th' engine stops, I'll tell you. In a little while the seesaw of the great sway beam ceased, and the huge fly paused in its revolutions. The iron ring of clogs sounded along the pavements, and the voices of the freed operatives were borne on the frosty air. Then the engineer sat down beside me, and taking off his greasy cap, which fitted his bald head like a skin, and wiping his face with a wad of cotton waste, he commenced. When I first started working with Dandy Dick, he were a 30-year-old bachelor, and there were a deal of speculation as to who he'd wed. There were been a few lasses as looked in his direction, but he used to say his 4-loom waivers were not in his line. Those as didn't care about him made out he was waiting for Gaffer's daughter, but that were no but gam with a bit of spite in it. One day, however, he were caught, and not with golden bait neither, for he were no but a poor lass, a dressmaker, but as well favoured as here and there you see one. Her earn was as bright as the stars, and her lips fair asked you for kisses, part speaking. Bless her, who were as fresh as a spring posy, a bit soft happen, but then who were no but a lass, and like all lasses fine, and set up with a fella. For Dick were a gradely chap, one as only woman might be proud on. They made a pratty pair, they did for sure, and folk used to say they were sharp for one another. When they'd been a gate a bit, and the shyness were gone, who started coming on Saturday afternoons to th' engine house when all were quiet like, and Dick were fettling up and cleaning. Who fair brought sunshine with her, did the lass, and Dick seemed would leap up and he'd put his arm round her and kiss her, and call her all mats of pratty names. It were on one of these afternoons, while we were standing in beam chamber and watching Dick a gate of cleaning, that who asked him all of a sudden like if th' engine had getten a name. Yah, he said, they call it Hercules. That's no gradely name, who says, we'll change it and call it after thee. But the Gaffer's daughter's wet its shed, he laughed. Wet its shed? What's that? Who asked. Then he telled her how as when th' engine were first started, the Gaffer's lass broke a bottle of wine over at beam, and called it by the name he'd told her on. Then I'll call it her again, who said, and by your name and all. But, said Dick, we've getten the wine. Never mind, who says, what'll do. Nay, says Dick, we mun have summat stronger nor water, and he sent me for half a gallon of out 4penny. I weren't long got a job, I can tell you, and come back with it in a can with a couple of tots. Then Liz, for that were her name, filled one of 'em, and degged the engine with it, and told it were coward after its meister, Dandy Dick. And when who'd finished, we sat down and laughed our fill. And drank your fill too, I suppose, I said. You're right, we did. We sat down and supped, and him and her supped sorrow, as you'll hear, for in a bit we get merry, and when all left him, they both had aboon their share. Well, you know th' story. Women's no but women at best of times, and they don't mend themselves by supping ale. If Dick had married Liz and not left her to her shame, there'd have been no tale to tell. But he didn't, and a weary job it turned out. Yai, he threw th' lass up, not as a blamed lad altogether, for you see his aunt were always at him, and th' old woman said as if he wed her, who'd leave him bark brass. One day I cornered him. Dick, I says, thou's never bound to sell thy honour for thy aunt's brass hearter. At first he shamed, then he stammered at summat about his aunt being worth £1,000. £1,000 be damned, I said, if that's the price they sells yon lass, for thou never lives to spend it. Money's time I've thought about those words sin then, for once in my life Thormeaty gave me wit and I spoke the truth, but I'm getting on too fast with me tale. Folk didn't let Dick alone, I can tell you. The parson got hold on him and gave him a bit of religion, and his mates cried shame on him, and how well he thinking a wed lass if he hadn't settled job for hersel, and him and all." "Settled it? How?" I asked. "Nah, I'm getting at it. You know t' gangway that runs out into t' lodge yonder, with sluice at th' end on it?" I nodded assent, having often seen the old man walk the plank to turn the wheel at the farther end. "Well, one morning a bit afore 6 o'clock, Dick went to turn up water. I watched him, for he were in a merry mood and whistling the girl I left behind me. It were a grand morning and all, sun rising o'er th' hills and mist lifting, and as quiet as though it were a Sunday. Just afore he get to th' end, he pulled up and looked round about at moors and at the meadow and the trees that sloped at lodge banks. Then when he get to t' wheel, he looked down into t' water, and his e'en seemed to leet on summat he hadn't reckoned on. I thought he were never bound to lift his head no more, and when he did, he staggered back across plank into th' engine house and fell in heap on floor. I can see him now," said the old man, rising from his seat, the light of memory kindling in his eyes. "He lay there," and he pointed to a slab near the door, "with his face bleached and sweat pouring off him as though he'd been pooed out of the lodge hisself. Curious like, I ran to th' end at plank to see what it were as had frightened him, and I seed what I've never forgotten." The old man paused, for his voice grew thick, and lifting the wad of cotton waste which he held in his hand to his old rheumy eyes, he tried to staunch the rebellious tears that stained his grease-smeared face. "You saw Liz, I suppose?" I said. "Yai, it were Liz, poor lass, with her face turned upwards. The face I'd seen him kiss so many times, but the colour were washed out on it, and the lips were drawn, and her ear were thick with slutch at lodge. Well, it were a village, I can tell you. There were more at the burying than I've ever seen afore or sin. Then, in a bit, the lass were forgetting, for where folks has to work for their living, they don't fret long o'er spilt milk. But there was one as didn't forget her, though he tried to, and that were Dick hisself, like as he couldn't get over it, and no wonder. He were like a chap possessed, with his een on the strain, as if he were always expecting to see summat. It were a change, I can tell you. Him as used to be coolest hand in factory, starting and trembling and sweating, as though he were followed by summat he couldn't lay. Afore long he fell off his meat, and like them as can't eat, he took to supping more nor were good for him. He couldn't bide to be alone neither, and yet he did naught but curse if you spoke to him. In a bit everybody took to keeping out of his gate, and the children used to follow him and ask him for halfpennies, would run away and scrape when he offered 'em brass. To those days we keep a cat in th' engine house called Brimstone, 'cause it was so fond of carrying in fire oils. It took again him and all, and the cratur used to rub itself about his legs and eat his meat, would fly from his shadow as though it were that of the Dearl himself. One day he called it to him, but when he get hold on it, it spit and scratted so he threw it with a curse into t' wheel race. All the same, when th' engine stopped, the cat climbed up the cogs and marred and scuttered round till he felled it with a bar. Well, the days went on as days will do, and what wi' 'em, but they brought no rest to Dick, and he get wur and wur. He took to talking a deal to hisself, or else to somebody nobody could see but hisself. Then like as he get restless, and would halt th' engine when it were running, and in those parts we no but reckon toil when it's standing, and he'd play the mountebank and the fool among wheels. Mony a time I've trembled as I've watched him, but he weren't to be killed by machinery. There were no such luck for him. It were worse for poor lad when he'd to go and turn on sluice for t' wheel, and many's the time he asked me to do it for him, but I weren't always about, and then he were forced to go and do it hisself. It were one of these times I met him as he come back reeling as though he were drunken, and with a face like a chap as had seen summat from another world. "Harry," he says, gripping me by th' arm and leaving a bruise that were aboon a bit in leaving me, "Harry, who's brought yon lass back?" "What lass?" I says. "Thou knows," he shouted, "and if thou's done it, by God, I'll do for thee." "I don't know what thou's raving about," I says. "Thou should sup less, and then thou'd talk sense." Dost a mean to say thou doesn't know as Liz is lying in th' lodge yonder? No, nor thee neither. There's 8 foot of earth to get through afore Liz can get to th' lodge, and then I told him again to suck less. Harry, he whispered, a chap mun do summat when he carries hell in his inside, and he swung round on his heel and left me. But after that he always walked up plank to th' sluice with his een shut. I'm wearying you, but I'm welly done. There's not much more to tell. One November afternoon, just as daylight were dying, and they were lighting up in factory, the wheel get too much speed on, and Dick went out to th' sluice. I never gave it a thought what he were bound to do, or I would have done it for him, though I could remember that after all he shut his een as he walked out at the door on the gangway. But like as it never come to me at the time, or things would have turned out different happen, and yet I durn know. It takes a deal of wit to fight against fate, and then you like to be licked in th' end. Well, as I tell you, I went on with my work about giving a thought to Dick, till it was stopping time. Then I remembered I hadn't seen him since he went to slow down wheel, and that were aboon an hour afore. Summat told me as all weren't right, and I took th' lantern and ran out to th' sluice. But there were naught but the water, and I could see naught as far as the shine of the lantern carried. In a bit there were a cry after Dick, and they lighted fires and dragged lodge, but they didn't find him till they ran it off, and then they come up poor lad fast in mud, and just underneath spot where they found Liz. And what was the verdict at the inquest? Accidental death? Yah, accidental death, but if he didn't slip off plank with walking with his een shut, he what? Oh, nothing, said the old man. I hid my curiosity by silence, for I was eager for the sequel, and knew that silence was its only key. Nor was I mistaken, for in a minute or two afterwards, as I was about to leave him, he beckoned me and whispered, I'm not a religious chap, and I've never troubled churches or chapels in my life, but if Dick didn't slip off the plank with his een shut, he slipped off because he opened 'em, and saw her come to fotch him.